Hello, everyone. This is lecture 1 of lesson 30, entitled Following Augustus's Act, the Julio-Claudians. So we have spent quite a bit of time now talking about Augustus. And one thing that's very clear is that he was quite purposeful both in trying to shape his own representation in his lifetime, but also that he was quite focused on how he might be seen upon his death. And I think the best sort of visual representation of this is, in fact, his mausoleum, which you can see here on the right side as a drawing. This is what it might have looked like in real life. So this, what this slide shows us is that there was a very famous Hellenistic king who had a super-sized funerary monument that is to scale here on the left. That was the original the original mausoleum, if you wish. But this here, this tiny thing here, is the average size of a Roman funerary monument in the period of Augustus's lifetime. And so just for scale, it's helpful for us to see how much the funerary monument that Augustus planned for himself was sort of a really ginormous, by comparison, monument to his interpretation of his life. And this is why it also included the inscription of the Res Gestae, his On My Deeds text, which we have read together. Augustus, in fact, was preparing for his own death in one other way, which is that he has been thinking about whom he wanted to succeed him. And there were a number of candidates. And in order to understand this, we will have to think again about the Julio-Claudian family tree. So you recall we have seen this family tree before. We looked at Julius Caesar, we looked at Augustus himself. And so now it's time to think about who were those male relatives who were candidates for the job of succeeding Augustus. And one issue that is very clear here is that Augustus was married, let's count, 1 time and 2 times, right? The first wife, Scribonia, he had 1 child with, who was called Julia. And with his second wife, he actually did not have children who lived. That was a stillborn baby. But she, from a prior marriage, had 2 sons, Tiberius Claudius Nero and Drusus. And what's important about this is that when Augustus married Livia, as she is best known, she was actually pregnant with a child from the previous marriage, which quite a few people thought was rather scandalous. Of course, Augustus consulted priests and sort of tried to make it look really good. But the point that matters is that this is how we end up with a family tree. This is why it's called a Julio-Claudian family tree, because Augustus brings in the Julius name, right? He takes his adoptive father's name, so he's called Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus Augustus. And from this first husband of his wife, the Claudius name comes in, right? So Julio-Claudian family tree. Because, as we will see, Augustus will adopt the son who is known as Tiberius, and he will adopt a bunch of other children who come from marriages of his daughter Julia. So there are quite a number of potential heirs here. If I want to be very cynical, I would say that the easiest way to see on this chart who the biggest, most important heirs were, is to look at the marriages of Octavian Augustus's daughter, Julia, right? So she was married, let's count it, 1, 2, 3 times. And the first time she was married to Claudius Marcellus. And however, Claudius Marcellus died in 23 BCE, so he will be outlived by far by Augustus. The second candidate, Claudius Marcellus, was an extended family member on this side. The second husband of Julia was Agrippa. you recall, Agrippa is the one who is there at the Battle of Actium and who is his sort of right hand man. And from that marriage, actually, there are quite a few children. Here is Agrippina, here is Gaius and Lucius Caesar. There is a girl, very creatively named Julia Caesaris. And then there is another Agrippa, and that Agrippa is called Agrippa Posthumus because that baby boy was born after his father had passed away. Posthumus meaning after the father's death. So Augustus was clearly interested in these young men as potential heirs. And so he actually adopted two of them, but they were too young at this point. So the second potential candidate for succeeding Augustus was Agrippa. However, he passed away in 12 BCE. So essentially, it looks like anybody he picks dies soon after. At that point, poor Julia had to marry his stepbrother. No, this is not in any way problematic in terms of blood relations, but nevertheless, he had to marry Tiberius, and that was her third marriage and his second. And at that point, also Augustus adopted Tiberius to be his heir, and he was the one that stuck. Sadly, those boys, Gaius and Lucius, from Julia's prior marriage to Agrippa, passed away. And so in 4 CE, Augustus adopted Tiberius, as well as that posthumous son, Agrippa Posthumus. And however, Agrippa Posthumus was later exiled. And in addition to that, Tiberius had one more obligation, is that he had to actually adopt Germanicus, who was a young family relative who was probably thought of as the most charismatic and militarily prepared heir to Augustus. At any rate, the way the story works out, that in 13 CE, Tiberius was given powers that were equal to Augustus, including, very importantly, the tribunician power, which you recall gives him the right to veto and makes his life sacred, as well as the major proconsular imperium, the major proconsular power that guaranteed him control over the majority of the army. And so when in 14, Augustus passed away, in fact, Tiberius was already vested with those powers, so that wasn't a big worry about him having to claim these powers as new. Now, one part of the story that's interesting about this is that Tiberius's mother, who is best known to us as Livia, was in fact a very powerful figure in Augustan rule. If you read Mary Beard, you can see sort of little details about it, like she essentially had a title that was the equivalent of princeps, which is the princeps, the name that Augustus used. And also she was widely represented. For example, quite a few people think that on the altar of peace, behind Agrippa, we can see Livia, and some people would even argue that that Livia may have had a hand in Augustus's death in 14 CE, as she was concerned about Agrippa Posthumus still being alive and getting older, and Germanicus, and especially Agrippa Posthumus, I think, because that was a direct bloodline from Augustus. That was sort of a matter of concern. And I think that what Tiberius had going for him, nevertheless, was that he was already vested with all those powers. This was the right time in 14 CE. And so when he became emperor, he in fact promptly did one thing, which was to kill Agrippa Posthumus, just in case anybody had any ideas. And soon afterwards, Germanicus also died, among somewhat mysterious circumstances. And so we get this very clear sense that, in fact, the worst thing that could ever happen to you is that you were born into the Julio-Claudian family, especially if you were a male, because then as soon as you were starting to get close to adulthood, there would be concern or worry or about you potentially wanting to become emperor. And so there was this sort of within the family, the intra-family rivalry that eventually, if we come back to the family tree, led to the family dying out, because if you keep killing your family members, at a certain point, you might just run out of them. There is one last comment I want to make about this family tree, and that has to do with the number of people on this chart who are called Tiberius Claudius Nero. There are quite a few of them. There is one here, Livia's first husband. There is here the Emperor Tiberius, about whom we are just starting to speak, as well as Tiberius Claudius Nero, an emperor to 41, all the way to 54, actually, and then 54 to 68. Another Emperor, Tiberius Claudius Nero. So for simplicity's sake, for the longest time, Roman historians identify these men who had the same full name because they came from the same family, and the Romans are not super creative about giving names. The first one by Tiberius, the second one by the second name Claudius, and the third one by the last name Nero. This is going to be the famous emperor, much disliked by many. And so I think the first takeaway from this is to give us a sense that the family, in fact, was very much wanting to keep its power, but in the process, they also essentially got rid of family members who were potentially risky, and that's how we end up with a family dying out in 68 CE. There's one more point I wanted to make before we get into sort of more details about Tiberius's role. And I wanted to show you a silver cup that probably dates to the early reign of Tiberius. And the reason I'm showing you this cup, because I think that I would like you to be mindful about the religious elements of representation that keep going after the death of Augustus, who is, of course, Augustus himself is declared a god and gets, worship after his death in Rome. And what we see here, however, is a representation of Tiberius. So what you see up here is Tiberius on what is a triumphal chariot. And you recall triumph is sort of a very important ritual in the life of every powerful Roman male. And you might also recall that starting under Augustus, only members of the imperial family got triumph. So here is Tiberius triumphant. You can even see this guy behind him who is reminding him that he is mortal. He's still alive. He will be a god, or he will try to become a god when he dies, as all emperors do. But it's also interesting, pardon me, what you see on the other side of the cup, and that is sacrifice. And I think that it gives us a sense that, in fact, although Tiberius only became Pontifex Maximus once Augustus died, that in fact this package of powers that emperors now get is both political and religious, right? So we see that it's the idea that the emperor is sort of militarily successful or that he's politically successful goes hand in hand with a sense that the emperor is also sort of pious and takes care of Rome's well-being in religious terms. So that's the end of lecture 1 for lesson 30.